Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action. A very good morning to everybody who's joined us across the Asia-Pacific region. And indeed, if you've joined us from Europe and Africa, where it is the small hours of the morning, thank you for being here. And a very good afternoon or good evening to everybody with us across the Americas. We're going to be joined today by Naina Batra, the chairperson of AVPN, the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, and Jonathan Wong, who is heading up the regional efforts for a Singapore headquartered B2B tech startup that's active across the Asia-Pacific region, but still very much in stealth mode. He used to work at Uber in a previous life and indeed at Pottinger now sometime in the past, but it's great to have them both with us. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to a little bit of the context to today's discussion. The first thing is, as I think we're all well aware, the impact of the COVID crisis across Asia has been significantly lower. The blue line on this chart is the European region, and the purple line is the Americas, and the red line is Asia. Clearly, there have been still significant impacts, but Asian countries broadly have responded more quickly and more effectively from a health point of view, and that has some quite interesting implications looking forward. Particularly, we had a lot of discussion about flattening the curve a month or so ago, and as the red line here for Korea and the gold line for Australia and the blue line for Singapore shows, that can be done and can be done effectively with the right action. New Zealand is the black line that's barely got a kink at the bottom of the page. Just looking a little bit more broadly than that, I think the other thing that's very interesting is just to step right back and think about what has happened to economies over time, what will happen to economies going forward. And this is a chart that I'm sure you will all have seen at some point in some variation, where it shows the composition of GDP globally by region, and you can see the Asian region, which is really the slices at the top of this chart, the red and yellow slices, has been materially lower part of global economic output for the last 100 years or so, but that has really shifted dramatically. And the interesting question is, of course, if Asian countries have been less significantly impacted and perhaps are rebounding more quickly, will that shift accelerate? It's an interesting question we might perhaps come back to in the discussion today. So with that as introduction, I will hand over to Paul Herman in San Francisco, a little bit closer to our guests who are joining us from Singapore. So Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and welcome everybody to ESGX. Excited today for Naina Batra and Jonathan Wong to join us to cover pandemic pivots across Asia. Now remember, Asia is made up of several billion people in China, in India, Japan, Korea, in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Singapore, Cambodia. So Naina's going to give us an overview of what's happening in business, health, and society. And we'll present some slides. And then we'll have an interactive conversation with Naina, Jonathan, Nigel, and myself. So Naina, if you're ready, feel free to come off video and give us an overview of what's happening and how the pandemic is affecting Asia and how people may be pivoting.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning and good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining this telecast from. I am indeed really excited to be here and share about what is going on in Asia. As Nigel mentioned in his introduction, Asia is where it all began. And I think for us here in this part of the world, we've been living with COVID-19 since pretty much the beginning of the year. So, right from Lunar New Year, when a number of schools closed in a number of countries and are just about opening up in those countries, it has affected Asia in a variety of ways. I would like to actually now show some of the slides, but it seems as if the video is stuck, but there we are. So I just thought before I started telling you about what's going on in Asia currently, I would share what AVPN does. So AVPN, which is the organization that I lead, is the largest social investing network in Asia. It has more than 600 members who deploy capital towards impact. And why is that important? Well, as in Asia, as in across the world, there is a big divide between those who actually have the wealth and those who do not. There's also a growing concentration of wealth in Asia. Asia is the continent which has the highest number of billionaires that are growing. And we also are the continent, unfortunately, that has the most number of disasters, whether those disasters be environmental or they be economic. So because of that, we feel that it is important that we see how we can actually bridge that divide. How do we actually address some of these complex issues of inequality? And AVPN strives to do that through its members, who last year deployed close to $10 billion towards impact across Asia. So how do they do that? Our members actually work across what we would like to call a continuum of capital. This continuum straddles philanthropy, venture philanthropy, impact investment, and socially responsible investment. Our members use a range of instruments, including grant, debt, and equity. And all of this is supported by both human capital and intellectual capital. So in the form of capacity building, in the form of technical assistance and support to these organizations. So our members support both nonprofits as well as for-profit enterprises, provided that they are focused on creating impact, and impact is clearly embedded into their business models. As I mentioned, COVID-19 has been part of Asia since January, since the beginning of the year. And if we look across the map, you will see that there is literally no country in Asia that has not been affected by the coronavirus. Of course, some countries have handled it much better than others. And I think Nigel mentioned New Zealand. New Zealand is definitely one of those countries. Taiwan, I would mention, is another one. And so is Hong Kong. All of these actually closed down very early. They flattened the curve, and they are now back and open for business. China, of course, had the first major case of the outbreak in Wuhan, had probably the most draconian lockdown that one had seen. But China now as well is back in business with people going back to school, offices opening up, as well as shops and restaurants. How has the response to this COVID-19 actually been? If you want to track the response, there is a response that has happened, obviously from philanthropic funders, which has been to address the humanitarian needs, as you would expect. Whether you look at this in India, where collaborative platforms have been amongst the ones that have led the effort. There have been successful crowdfunding platforms that have taken place, as well as the government's call for donations of a philanthropic nature into the Prime Minister's Emergency Fund. We've also seen a lot of collaboration come across the continent. So in Indonesia, a bunch of AVPN members actually set up what they call the Gotong Royong movement, which is actually a bridge across Indonesia and bringing people together. One of the most innovative projects that are listed on Gotong Royong is one called Light Up Indonesia, which has been sort of started out by YCAB and Indica Foundation, where philanthropists, where individuals can support by paying utility bills for those who are less fortunate, thereby sparing up, hard needed cash to buy rice or buy food or buy other things which are far more important. We've also seen collaborative platforms in China, where we've seen one of the largest nonprofit consortiums come together, led by the Narada Foundation, which was launched under a week after the virus was declared, and it coordinated and deployed resources to more than 40 nonprofits across China. Finally, there's one which I would like to talk about, which actually straddles both philanthropy and corporates, which is in Manila, called Project Ugnayan. Started and initiated by the Ayala Foundation, 1.5 billion pesos was raised by the top 20 business groups in the Philippines to actually look at providing food rations to Greater Manila area when the lockdown was suddenly announced by the Duterte government. If we move on to what investors have done, it is very interesting, and you know, I'm sure we'll hear more from Jonathan about this. But investors have looked not just at you know, sort of supporting philanthropic efforts, but actually also looking at how they can help support their portfolio companies. As I mentioned, a lot of our members invest in companies and startups that have social impact built into them. Startups have probably had the worst sort of experience in this pandemic. Those who had a short runway have found themselves with no runway at all. Those who had a medium runway are facing a very short runway. And what we have found is that a lot of investors have actually come back to support their investee companies by providing credit, by providing technical assistance, by helping their entrepreneurs move from an entrepreneurial growth mindset to a liquidity management mindset, which is what I think is needed about this pandemic and this crisis. So for instance, Cois Invest in India, which is one of our members, has actually set up a parallel vehicle to support their investee organizations with emergency funding. Another one called Omnivore, which supports organizations that are working in the agricultural space, have suggested that their portfolio companies do not fire people, but actually reduce salaries at senior management and maintain salaries of people at the entry level. We've also seen organizations like Circulate Capital that have actually increased investments at this time to look at focusing or continuing their focus on environment and on actually mitigating the ocean plastic crisis. One of the things that we find that happens in times of crisis, people actually move from mission-based investing to looking at much more, sort of trying to protect their existing investments or trying to get out of a pretty volatile market. We have luckily found that there are investors who have chosen to stay with their investments, who have chosen to continue to drive their mission-based investments, as well as actually support existing portfolio companies by taking steps to help them, keep their operations going, to help them with their cash flow and with their short-term financial crisis. Moving on, if we look at what corporates have done, that has also been very interesting in Asia. We find that a lot of companies, like in the United States, have actually shifted their production lines. So ST Engineering has started producing medical-grade surgical masks for Singapore. Maruti Suzuki, which is a car manufacturer, aims to produce about 10,000 ventilators per month in India by collaborating with local manufacturers. We've also found corporates providing financial assistance to their employees. So Prudential, for instance, provided employees in Singapore and their immediate family members who were served with quarantine orders a one-time cash benefit. We've also found that stakeholders, so shareholders, lenders, investors in corporates have actually come out with very, very strong statements about their companies actually supporting marginalized communities, about supporting their own communities where they operate through the COVID crisis. So we have found a number of corporates actually step up and declare large sums of money that they are now allocating to COVID relief. So how has this landscape actually responded? We find that there are a number of solutions that have been put forward by this MSME landscape, by social enterprises actually, who have been probably one of the most innovative throughout this crisis. So if you look at it, obviously those companies that are working in healthcare and virtual education or distance education, who have taken some of the most boldest steps. So Jagami, which is a digital healthcare platform that enables access to quality healthcare through a global community care network. This is directed especially at seniors and those who have different kinds of abilities, have looked at providing immediate relief through telehealth. what we have seen in a lockdown situation across countries in Asia, those that have been affected probably the most are the elderly and the ones with disabilities. And having telehealth, or having options to access health and relief through a virtual platform has proved very, very helpful for some of these. Education is another one that has been severely affected. And what we find is organizations like Sesame Workshop and Pratham, who have developed content that actually can reach children that are now being pushed to stay at home across countries as large and diverse as Indonesia or India, have proved to be very, very useful, because these are parents and children across varying socioeconomic groups, across varying learning systems, who are now having to sort of cope with the educational and academic demands from home. We're also finding that there are organizations like Good Financial and SDI Academy that are supporting marginalized communities with daily necessities from food to income. So what we are finding is Good Financial is a social enterprise in Hong Kong that actually provides ethical low-interest loans to migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong, especially those who are in debt traps, who are unable to send money back home. We're finding that there is an organization called SDI Academy, which distributes daily essentials to migrant workers at their doorsteps. Migrant workers have been one of the communities that have been most affected. If you looked at the pre-run before we started speaking, Singapore has had a surge, and that surge came actually from migrant workers that are here in Singapore, as their dorms, where most of them live, turned out to be very, very affected. So I'm going to stop there in case there are any questions, or in case anyone would like to ask something.
Great. Well, Naina, thanks very much for that overview. And when you're the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network, what countries does that cover? And how are you seeing higher or lower participation from different countries?
So the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network, or AVPN, has members from more than 42 countries, but our area of operations, we look at Asia Pacific pretty broadly. So it sort of goes east of Turkey all the way to Australia and Oceania. So we have members from New Zealand all the way to Turkey who are focused on impact in Asia. In terms of countries, I think, we've seen, as you described very, very nicely in your introduction, we've seen different levels of activity as the virus has spread. And as I mentioned, for most of us in Asia, when the rest of the world was kind of referring to this as a virus somewhere there in China, we were kind of very much, it was happening in our backyard all the way from the beginning of the year. So we have literally seen the virus that has spread from, I would say, the end of December, beginning of January, kind of taking a peak with Lunar New Year, which was end of January, beginning of February, to now. Again, also for a lot of countries, the memory of SARS is pretty fresh. So if you look at the countries that reacted the first and probably the strongest were those like Hong Kong, China, and Taiwan, which have very, very clear and strong memories of SARS, where, I think citizen action was very, very prompt, with people wearing masks and, making sure that they socially distanced even before governments made it mandatory. That, I think, has really helped keeping the virus flat.
Super. All right, and then from the impact investing side, or from the philanthropy side, has that shifted in 2020? Has venture investing gone up or down? Has impact investing gone up or down? Has philanthropy gone up or down?
So I think philanthropy has definitely shifted. We saw the first knee-jerk reaction, which was to sort of look at shifting all philanthropic dollars towards COVID relief, and towards looking at how we could support, philanthropic organizations could support humanitarian assistance. I think that was natural and in some ways, to be expected. Nonprofits have been very concerned and very worried about the fact that what does this mean about long-term systems change? What does it mean about funding to sectors like the environment or gender or health that is not related to the COVID virus? And we are working with our members for a pledge that will come up on the AVPN platform very shortly, which talks about how foundations and funders are going to address some of these issues that nonprofits have raised. In terms of impact investment and their investee organizations, as I mentioned, I think the concern is, how will some of these MSMEs and SMEs actually ride out the crisis? I think it's a global phenomena where you are seeing people go out of work. You're seeing businesses shut shop, especially in the food and beverage industry, or even in the logistics industry, where they've been very, very badly hit by the lockdown. So there are organizations that impact investors have invested in that are involved in distribution, that have supply chains. In countries like India, which has seen probably one of the most draconian lockdowns globally, when you're finding large corporations like Amazon or Flipkart that are unable to get their supply chains running and up and going, then a small social enterprise or an SME or an MSME has very little chance. So we are finding that it is very important and urgent to see if there can be relief packages that can actually be put out by impact investors and by DFIs that will actually help some of these investee organizations actually ride out the storm.
Yeah, so today or this week, Prime Minister Modi of India has announced a 10% of GDP stimulus. And back in Europe, Denmark was 12% of GDP as a stimulus. What would you see impact investors doing? Like, how would impact investors pivot for this? For example, as I had a meeting scheduled with a foundation that's now pushed off to the next meeting because they're swarming on COVID-19 relief. What are impact investors doing differently?
So I think impact investors have realized that this is a time to actually come together and not really be very closed or very protective of their deal flow. We are finding a number of impact investors in our network who are looking to collaborate with others to look at providing lines of credit and providing cheaper capital or discounted capital to their investee organizations in order to help them survive through this crisis. There are a number of stabilization programs or stabilization funds that are up for discussion right now amongst groups of our investors. One that actually AVPN is also helping to form by bringing different groups of our members together to see if we can provide a pool of capital that will be available for these organizations and for these impact investors to divert towards their investees so that they can meet their salary requirements, ensure that livelihoods are maintained and people don't lose jobs.
So on a previous ESGX, in fact, last week, we talked about the return on investment of people and human capital, because people invent products, they serve customers, they work together as teams. So is that a surprise for the impact investors across the different countries and the regions, or is it a tougher sell for some versus others?
I think it's been more of a surprise how they have accepted this. So I think it's been much more where impact investors are really sort of stepping up and saying that, this is why we wanted to become impact investors. We are actually, you asked me earlier, are we seeing a rise in impact investing? I think what we are seeing across AVPN right now is the interest, especially amongst family offices, now to look at diverting parts of their portfolio towards investing with impact. And that has not changed in spite of a number of family offices finding that the total value of their portfolio has actually reduced quite significantly as a result of this crisis. But we are finding that there's a lot of interest and also capital flowing towards investment. Of course, there are a few opportunistic investors as well who are looking at this as a way to get a cheap investment or to get into companies or invest into companies that were not open for investment earlier. we are finding as well with a lot of the regional dynamics that some of this capital is flowing to some countries in particular, where we are seeing an increase in investment. We are not finding so much that at this point there is a shrinking in the capital that is available for impact investing.
Okay, so that's on the impact investing front. We talked a little bit on the philanthropy front. What have you observed from Turkey to India to China to Oceania in terms of any other progress like environmentally? So for example, one of the ongoing challenges here in the train wreck that is the current US administration, there's rollbacks of environmental rules and agricultural rules and the like. So are you seeing observations of that in terms of societal or environmental laws or policies, or is it strengthening?
So it hasn't, so, I think that's been the worry in terms of the fact that with the focus on saving, sort of immediate lives or tackling the immediate crisis, are we going to, sort of swerve away from some of the environmental gains that have been made? I think societally, there has been across the continent a real awakening to the fact that we are back down to where emissions were a decade ago. I think we've all seen these pictures of clear skies, blue skies, of being people in various parts of India and Nepal being able to see mountains which they hadn't seen for decades. And there is, I think, in terms of the average citizen, a much bigger sort of awareness that it is possible to go back or to reverse some of the damage that has been done by rapid industrialization. The question is, can we capitalize on this awareness to actually make sure that the laws are not taken back? I think what is scary, to be honest, Paul, is the fact that with the lockdown, a lot of the measures that are taken are very draconian in nature. And this is where governments are using some of these lockdown draconian laws to unfortunately overturn some of the strides that environmentalists had taken by pushing very, very hard to have laws put in that actually protected rather than harmed the environment. So I think that's the scary part, because in order to actually restart their economies, I do believe that some of these will be reversed. I mean, it's unfortunate, and they're being taken under the guise of the fact that this is what we need for recovery to take place.
I understand. And I want to thank Lauren Agnew for that question. So thanks, Lauren. Go ahead, Nigel. And do you want to bring in Jonathan and expand our conversation?
Jonathan, please join us. I think that might be a really neat segue, because Jonathan and I were talking a few days ago about.
Nigel, your audio needs to get cranked up.
Am I too quiet? You keep going, Paul, I'll figure it out.
Somehow it's getting discounted. But go ahead, ask John your question.
I was going to say, the question for John is the impact of very different responses around the region. Something we were talking about last week, which is there have been quite different measures in different places. Some seem to have been more effectively targeted than others. And from a business point of view, really interested in your perspectives on that.
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. Yeah, I think that the response, or I guess the government response to the COVID crisis around Asia has been very varied, right? Singapore, I would say, has done some pretty fantastic work in being transparent in some of the stimulus packages or recovery packages that they're putting in place, coming from all the way down to the lower income parts of the society, all the way through to kind of property owners and landlords, and with some guidance and structure on how does that cascade through the entire economy. Other markets within Asia have been a little bit less, I would say, I guess, directive, a little bit less transparent in how this money is going to be spent and how the stimulus should and how it will impact the various business people. One thing which I've noticed as we've kind of looked across the Asian region is that so much of what the mass market or the business community feels is directly contingent on the I guess buy-in or the investment that the government is making into their business lines. One nice example, which we've had in Singapore, is that when it comes to food delivery, we understand that the food delivery ecosystem is incredibly important given these lockdowns, and people need and want the assurance of having some of their favorite foods still come to them, right? The ability to go out and buy your groceries and bring that home to cook, it is limited, and of course, it's also a little bit frustrating given that now everyone's spending 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in their homes. So one package which the government has rolled out in Singapore is something which boosts the food delivery. It's lowered commissions for the restaurateurs, and therefore changing the economic profile of how of the delivery kind of proposition to them. And what it's done overall is fast forward the world to a little bit more of where we think the future will be. And the COVID kind of situation overall has been challenging, I think, across the globe. But I think when we look at the encouraging signs here, where it will go either from a corporate, philanthropic, or venture perspective, is that we've taken big steps towards the future. And there's risks there, obviously, on like whether or not we're doing the right things and what we think the future should be. But it's brought us to a place where now digitalization and the kind of adoption of technology has gone from 0 to 50 in a matter of weeks, if not shorter.
I'm interested in how you've managed that as well, because in some of my dealings with large corporates around the world, some of these opportunities can be there, but they can still find it incredibly hard to act, even in this kind of environment. And once again, it creates opportunity for change. We titled this episode Pandemic Pivots because in startup land, people have been pivoting for ages. If your business isn't working very well, you pivot slightly to something a bit different or something radically different. And it's much harder in large organizations. So I'm really interested in what you've done to try to go with the flow of these changes, and any perspective you've got perhaps for people who are trying to get larger organizations to seize the opportunity and move.
Yeah, look, I think it's about instilling that mindset into the entire organization. A startup and a large corporate, in many ways, are not that different. Like the circumstances impacting a 3-person team sitting in a garage trying to build up their startup, and a 3,000 large organization sitting in a beautiful office tower. The circumstances are similar. I think where we've seen the pivots be the most effective is when companies are not just looking forward to like, all right, how do we save ourselves? How do we save our employees tomorrow? Right? They need to have a bit of a longer term view on how things will change, right? And take principled bets on where the world is going to go. One thing which I've begun to see a little bit more of in startup land here is we know that this will eventually recover. And it may not be today, it might not be tomorrow, it might not even be in the next few weeks, but it will recover and we will return to a sense of a new normal. And there will be benefits from that pivot back to the new normal, whether it's in the form of discretionary spending or adoption of technology or digitalization, right? And businesses which are now kind of pivoting their resources internally for that new normal, given the capacity or given the ability to kind of shift focus and really get their house in order for this next phase of growth, those are the ones which I think are the best positioned for this new normal. Whether that's changing a proposition, whether it's messaging, whether it's investing into marketing and engaging with the customers over this challenging period. All these ways in which you're kind of investing into your business and into your consumer sets allow you to make that pivot a lot more seamlessly, because you're not making this in a black box. You're doing this in a way which is constantly engaging your audience and constantly engaging that group of customers, which you're going to have to go back to post-COVID.
Yeah, Paul, you look like you've got a question there.
Well, this is a question for both Jonathan and for Naina. So Sandra Beat would like to ask, what systems or management practices are most helpful in this time of having to pivot and be agile? So Naina had already mentioned taking care of employees, which hopefully most companies are supportive, the talent that invents their products. But what other management systems are there, including anything from health systems to economic systems to communication systems? So John, what do you think?
Look, there's a bunch of different kind of levels to how do you manage your teams and your business in this world. And I'll focus really on the very tactical, given that's how we've been living, many of us over the past few months. Look, I think it's about over-investing into your team and over-investing into the frequency of dialogue. In a startup, we've been in the startup land, we've been working remotely, or we've had this kind of flag of being able to work remotely for as long as I can remember. But it's interesting because even for us, where we have flexible work hours, flexible locations, staycations, workations, what you might call it. It's been tough for us. And everyone I've talked to in my community and my team, it's been difficult, right? Because what we're lacking today are those micro interactions which you just have from that brush at the water cooler, that coffee which you go down to get. And those interactions, while they might not be super dense in terms of content, they are super dense in terms of social interactions and kind of working through a lot of those cues, which I think we all as human beings need to rely on. So from a very tactical perspective, it's just about creating that frequency, finding the way to dialogue with your teams daily, intraday, twice, 3, 4 times per day. And it's through these interactions and through getting into the rhythm of having these conversations as much as you truly can, where you can make up for some of that discount, which we have today because we have to communicate digitally.
Got it. All right. And Naina, how about for you? What sort of systems are coming in handy? Either health systems or health sensing systems, communication systems?
So I think communication, as John mentioned, is very important. But I also think in terms of flexibility. So I think those organizations that are actually looking at the opportunity that this crisis has actually thrown up are the ones that are going to not only survive but actually thrive. So John mentioned that as startups they've been working virtually for as long as he can remember. For a lot of us, we've gone to do this, and it just shows how well we adapt. We're now all working virtually, right? And everyone from my grandmother to my daughter is on Zoom and on a virtual platform. So no matter how much we've talked about online learning or we've talked about telehealth, we've always said, yes, this is possible and this is going to happen. Well, now we've kind of moved to a point where we don't necessarily have to go back. So if you really think about in terms of the opportunity that this crisis presents, both to business as well as to those organizations that are seeking to further impact, it's huge. You can now reach communities that otherwise was very difficult to reach because of geographic distance. I mean, if you look at the number of islands there are in the country of Indonesia and how do you actually reach each and every one of them, we're suddenly finding out that that companies are ramping up bandwidth. It is now through technology easier to get services, get health, get education across to these kinds of communities. And when there is that, there's also an opportunity for business. And, right from, if you look at it, right from food delivery all the way to delivery of any other essential service, it's changed and it's never going to go back to what it was. So for me, organizations that are able to see that and have been able to pivot to meet those needs are the ones that are going to be the most successful. And it doesn't matter if it's a for-profit organization or an organization working in the nonprofit space. It's the one that are actually seeing this as an opportunity and actually investing right now in how that organization is going to meet that opportunity are the ones that are interesting.
Yeah, look, I think that's exactly right. And we've seen lots of examples where people are just prepared to change their behavior and prepared to try something new because the environment is much more extreme in some way.
Absolutely.
All right, so John, how many different countries have you worked in?
Sorry, say again?
How many different countries have you worked in?
Quite a few. 8.
Okay.
Yeah, 8. No, yeah, I've spent time in most of the Southeast Asian countries as well as most of the North Asian and of course Australia.
Sure. Okay, so tell us a little something about each of those countries and how they compare, contrast, and how they might be able to adapt to the pandemic. Are more developed countries better positioned? Are lesser developed countries better positioned?
Yeah, look, I think that it's a bit of a tale of, I'm going to just take North Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia as 3 different buckets. I think there's been a different story in each. North Asia, as I think, as we've kind of discussed here, has done, I think, generally speaking, a pretty good job. They had some pretty gnarly spikes early on in the journey.
Which countries are those? When you say North Asia, which countries?
Korea, Taiwan, Japan, primarily. South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. And these guys have done, I think, great work in scaling, testing, process, being very, very activist early on in making sure that they are being proactive in controlling spread. I was in Taiwan in early February, And a lot of the practice, which was already in play in Taipei at that point, what we would consider today, and even in Singapore and many other parts of the world, is best practice. And this was even before it had spiked in the rest of the world. Korea has broadly found a way to avoid any kind of system-wide or economy-wide shutdowns. And the teams that I've looked at and worked with in companies that I've seen in Korea continue to operate, even to the point now where I've had calls which have been super surprising, where people aren't wearing masks, which is a little bit fun and different to what you'd expect now in every other call which you have in a group setting. You take that down to like the places in Southeast Asia. Singapore, I think, has done a great job by and large controlling the situation here. If we look outside of the foreign worker dormitories, the community spread over since we've had this, what we call a circuit breaker in Singapore, has really brought down those cases. And I think the government has done great work in being transparent and communicative around what we need to be doing and what the pathway back to opening up or easing these restrictions looks like. Malaysia has begun to ease some of the movement control orders, and there's beginning to be a bit of a sense of normalcy, which is returning. And we go down to Australia and New Zealand, I think also, if we look back just a few weeks, the state of panic or the state of fear was very, very high, but it's rapidly evolved to a place where people are opening back up. Restaurants are beginning to open back up. Construction continues to chug along in such a property-dominated industry and economy, where we're seeing like these different tracks all kind of converge at some point in the future, but beginning to accelerate towards that normalcy in the state of new normal in this part of the world. I think what remains to be probably the most challenging and interesting question is, at what point do we start unlocking the intra-APAC or intra-ASEAN travel, which we know is so critical to the development and I think future growth of our interconnected APAC region.
Yeah, that's a really good point, John. And sorry, I'm just going to wind one thing in there, which is, no, Naina, you go ahead and answer, and then I'll come back with my question.
Sorry, Paul, you were asking me a question?
I was just going to say, for Naina, as a follow-up to that, what have you seen that's distinctive, if there are distinctions like urban versus rural, or at different sort of regions, sub-regions in different countries of Asia?
So I think it's, it's been interesting. There's been varying sort of degrees of lockdown and reaction to the crisis. So if you look at it, there's also been a difference in the amount of testing that has been done across Asia, if you were to call it that. And as John said, Singapore has been one of the countries that's been incredibly transparent, and it's also carried out probably the most number of tests. South Korea has been another one that has done that. You also see that there are countries like the Philippines or Vietnam that haven't done as many tests as Singapore or South Korea, but they've done a very aggressive form of lockdown, and they went into lockdown as compared to Singapore much earlier. So numbers have varied across the region, I think, because of that. But we are finding slowly that things are opening up. It's also been interesting when you look at different countries. So if you look at Metro Manila or you look at urban Jakarta, the lockdown there has been much more severe than it has been in the sort of hinterland or in the regions, and that's also been very, very interesting to see. I think India, for a lot of people in Asia, has been the outlier. Given the density and the huge population. I think everybody in the West was expecting to see a huge surge, and with their healthcare systems being terribly compromised, so far that doesn't seem to have happened. So they seem to have bucked the curve somewhat, either due to the draconian lockdown, or due to something else. It's not sure. I think it's what is going to be interesting is, as we are making these steps towards opening up, we're also sort of seeing mini surges that are happening. So South Korea opened up bars, Seoul opened up bars last week, And, all of a sudden there was a spike of 35 cases. So I think it's going to be for Asia, and which is something the rest of the world should also see, is how we kind of go back to normal. I mean, John talked about travel. I think for us in this region, especially both of us sitting in Singapore, it's very, very strange. I mean, this is the longest period I've ever gone without sitting on an airplane or without going to Changi Airport. And it's what this region really depends on. And that's what is going to be, I think, the most difficult challenge, is how do we open up our borders, and how do we actually bring that sort of communication and travel and trade between countries to go back to what it was. So I think that's the challenge, and we'll see how that goes. It's still very much, baby steps going forward, and all of us in Asia are looking at every other Asian country to see, what is it that they're doing, and what is the repercussion of that. So, Seoul opening bars, there are 35 cases. I'm sure Singapore is not going to open bars when we emerge from our circuit breaker on 1st of June.
It's very interesting because you compare the numbers that you've got in Asia with what we have in the United States, or in the UK or Russia, or in some countries in South America, where they're already starting to open up economies and relax the measures. The UK has been probably one of the most hopeless in terms of the vagueness of the plans and what's happening. And of course, the implications of all of that are that this will be much more drawn out in those countries, and that Asia is, even though you're facing your version of the challenge, but with much smaller numbers, enormously better prepared. And the question then, I guess, goes to what John was talking about, which is cross-border trade, cross-border travel. Where does this lead? Because you've got some countries, and so China's put a ban on some Australian beef exports. There's obviously lots of discussion in the US about, potentially limiting relationships with China and vice versa. All of that potentially damaging to those countries. So really interested in your perspectives on how this may play out from a, I guess, geo-economic point of view as much as anything else.
So I think I'll take a crack at it first. I think it's we as a region cannot function without trade, and for us, it's even though the trade war has been between the US and China, it has affected Asian countries enormously. And for us, trade across Asia and with China, part of it is why we woke up so early and why we reacted so early as well, is because if China sneezes, we get a cold. That's the reality of it. So we are very, very linked. Our economies are very linked, not just across ASEAN, but across Asia. And it's enormously important for us, therefore, to see how be constantly watchful how other economies are doing and how they're opening up. I mean, we have in Singapore itself, for instance, we have a large number of our workforce that comes from across the border in Malaysia. When Malaysia closed the border to control the virus, there were a large number of workers that were stuck here, that have been stranded and have been separated from their families in Singapore. So for us to really see how each country is opening up and how trade and cross-country travel takes off is very important to our recovery. I think if I look at you did say something in terms of the fact that our numbers are minuscule as compared to what we're seeing across the globe. I'll be really provocative and tell you that in Asia we tend to listen to our governments. We have I think it's part of it is cultural. We kind of do as we're told, and that's probably helped to sort of contain some of those numbers. And it's also helped because businesses have taken a lot of what governments have told them to do in terms of shutting down, in terms of following what has been laid out as well, very, very seriously. So I think in that sense, there's no easy answer. Our economies, unfortunately, are very, very closely linked. We will have to see what is the gradual opening up for us to be able to return to normal. there is also a distinct inequality in the kind of stimulus that governments are able to provide. So Singapore is incredibly generous and has provided one of the largest stimulus packages in Asia in order for us to protect our economy here. It's going to be much more difficult for countries like Vietnam or countries like Philippines, which depend a lot more on manufacturing, and for them to be able to open up, especially on demand from China, from Korea. Samsung's largest factory outside Korea is in Vietnam. So when can they go back to normal? So, things like that, I think, is something we'll have to wait and watch. I'm sure we are going to be as affected as everyone else with what comes post this, and it's not a pleasant sight as to what's going to come post this. But we are unfortunately very, very interdependent on each other.
I think one thing which Naina has mentioned is like this interconnectedness is so important to this part of the world. And bringing it back to the original thesis of one of these questions was, how does this change the world's economic center of gravity? And look, there's a ton of uncertainty here, but if we look forward and look at how we think that travel might open up, we look at the Trans-Tasman, I think, a travel bubble where there's going to be some potentially much more friction-free transport between Australia and New Zealand. You can imagine that as these Asian countries become a little bit more on top of this issue, and we start seeing cases decline across these different bilateral journeys, you could start seeing the opening up of specific routes. The Korea to China has begun a little bit along this effort. You can imagine this happening between Singapore and Malaysia at some point. And as the Asian transport routes open up, and we have these, what we would consider to be a little bit less risky hubs traveling from one to the other, you can see how this may actually start accelerating Asia's kind of part in the globe, in the kind of economic landscape, because we are able to kind of take advantage of the early measures that were taken in Asia and use that as a springboard or a launch pad into that next phase of growth, which will be there. We just got to know where to look.
Fantastic.
Okay, so we start to wrap up. What guidance do you think for the rest of 2020 and 2021 even would be most fruitful in learning how to pivot? Because there was a post-SARS, there's a post-MERS, there have been sort of mini recoveries along with those. So for this, are we going back to how everything was? Is there a new version of how things will be? What does it look like for 2020 and 2021?
I can take this first. I think there are two main changes which folks will need to kind of incorporate into the 2020-2021 planning. I think one is get ready for more of these, what do we call them, blocks or stoppages. I think one thing which we know will most likely happen, and we talk about this a lot when you look at the kind of healthcare bodies around the world, we will probably need to pause and suppress, and then reopen again. And we don't know when these things will come. It's a high degree of uncertainty, but what we know will happen is that there may be instances in the future where we're going to have to pause, suppress some of these the infection, and then reopen again. And these will be micro, I think, in nature. I don't think that we're going to have industry-wide lockdowns, economy-wide lockdowns in such a large degree for such extended periods of time. They will be much more targeted, whether it's in industry or whether it's certain geos or what have you. But we got to be ready for that. And the uncertainty that brings to many businesses, whether you're a services industry, luxury industry, digital industry, that will impact your business. And you have to be ready for that and incorporate that flexibility into your business planning from a budgetary resourcing planning perspective. I think that's one of the first things which we need to be abreast of. And I think the second one here is just around being future forward and future thinking. One of the nice things about this whole crisis, if we look at it on the bright side, it's brought the future forward to us today. And those businesses which I think are looking forward to what the new state of the world will look like and investing into that today, whether it's customer acquisition or engagement, or product market fit or technology improvements or tweaks to your app or what have you, I think that's going to be where those who are investing in today and over this period will be successful in 2020-21.
Great. And Naina, how about you?
I agree completely. I think, this is not going to go away. I mean, we are going to see some versions of this in the coming years. So, our ability to be kind of flexible, to be responsive in a sort of quick manner, to be able to pivot is going to be essential. I also think it's we can't go back to the way things were. I think it's enough of a wake up call, both in terms of of a systems change or a systems reset across all sectors of the economy and all sectors of government. I mean, I think this gives us an enormous opportunity to actually look at how do we make decisions, what kinds of decisions do we make, whether those decisions impact our society, whether they impact our business, or whether they impact our government. I mean, I'll go ahead and say this. If you look at the countries that have dealt probably in the best fashion with this crisis, most of them have been led by women. And that is something that is not just telling, but it's also interesting. And it's time that we look at how decisions are made. How do we look at where gender plays a role? How do we look at what is the kind of investment we make in health and in healthcare? What do we look at in terms of the industries that are going to be more critical as we face a future where these kinds of interruptions are going to become more the norm than something that is the exception. So I think how we react to that and how we face up to that is also going to determine how investors invest their money, where exactly are philanthropists looking to sort of guide and engage their philanthropic dollars. I think all of that is what we're going to see as new things in 2020, 2021.
Super. All right. Well, Naina Batra and Jonathan Wong, thanks very much for joining us today on ESGX and helping provide an even more global view for everybody to be informed and inspired and learn how to take more and unique actions, especially as a pandemic pivot. All right, Nigel, you always have good news for us. So can you wrap up with some good news before we come to a close?
Absolutely. And I thought I'd just take us, as we've talked a bit about how adversity creates opportunity because people around you are prepared to think differently. And I think both Naina and John have talked about how, when you're faced with a crisis like this, somehow just jumping into the middle of it and trying to try something new can work very well. So I thought I'd share a story, and this is not from current times, but it's played out over the last 15 years. And a farm in West Sussex called the Knepp Estate, which had faced a long period of investing in more and more capital to become more efficient and trying to get its marginal costs down to survive ongoing industrialization of farming, and found it harder and harder, and eventually decided to do exactly the opposite, which was to get rid of all the industrialization in their farm and set about returning the entire estate to nature. This turned out to be an amazingly complicated process because there were all sorts of regulations which meant it wasn't legal to make your farm wild again. So it's an extraordinary story. I won't tell it all now, but the takeaway from it, I think, was twofold. One was the land ended up being dramatically more productive than it had ever been before in terms of its ability to create various forms of produce. And of course, this produce isn't just free range now, it's entirely wild, and so is a super premium product. The second is that by just jumping in with the chaos that emerged from making the place wild again, they discovered and enabled all sorts of things in the ecosystem, which actually made it way more healthy than it was at the beginning. There is a book about all of this, which is called Wilding by Isabella Tree, who is the partner of the guy whose family has owned this estate for many hundreds of years. Fantastic read. And there's wonderful parallels between embracing what nature is like and the randomness of nature and what you can do in the business world. So that was the good thing. Whilst we're on the subject of books, we now have added to our website the bookshelf, if you like, a virtual bookshelf. We often mention books as we go through this show. So we're capturing here those books and very happy to add others to that as we come across them. I should just say as well, talking of things that you can do and good news, Naina's organization has a virtual conference coming up in about a month or 6 weeks' time. And we'll put, again, a link to that on the website and in social media. So please do take a look at that, sign up and join. And the last thing from me, of course, if you have a moment and you have been enjoying our shows and our discussions, firstly, please, if you have things you would like us to cover, people you would like us to get on the show, let us know and we will do our best to do that. And if you have a moment, do take a moment to share these things with other people, follow us on YouTube or like the YouTube video, post on social media, etc. All of that helps spread the messages that our various guests are bringing to the show and which we are trying to get out there and trying to help people learn from in a sense of positive opportunity in the face of all this crisis. So with that, I will hand back to Paul, who may want to talk a little bit about what's coming up over the next few weeks as well.
Yeah, happy to, Nigel, and happy for all of us to be a community of action and positive, constructive views to create the society and the lives that we actually want to live in. So on our next ESGX, next Tuesday, back to the regular time, 2 p.m. Pacific, will be the focus on sustainable food systems. So Craig Wickner of Farmland LP, which helps make farmland go from brown to green, will be a guest, and we'll have some other guests as well. The following week, we're going to bring back the monthly Green Jobs Report, as well as a pilot, a show with pilots of Green New Deals and jobs guarantees. So Scott Fulweiler of University of Missouri, Kansas City, and Dr. Fadil Kaboub from the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity will be joined by their teammates. And then coming up that'll be May already, and then coming up in June will be a focus on oceans and wildlife and other topics. So please check the ESGX site. So again, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being educated, inspired, and willing to take action. As Nigel said, share among your friends, family, colleagues, and leaders what these actions can be, and let's make the world what we want it to be. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.